A Million Miles in 1,000 Years by Donald Miller. When Steve, Ben, and I first started working together, I didn't want Don to embrace conflict. I wanted it to be an easy story, but nobody really remembers easy stories. Characters have to face their greatest fears with courage. That's what makes a story good. If you think about the stories you like most, they probably have lots of conflict. There's probably death at stake, inner death or actual death. These polar charges, these happy and sad things in life are like colors God uses to draw the world. I was watching the news the other night and they were still covering that story in Mumbai about the terrorists who went on a shooting rampage. The man on the news said that before the terrorists killed the Jews in the Jewish center, they tortured them. I had to turn off the TV because I could see the torture in my head that they were describing. I kept imagining these people just living their daily lives and then having them suddenly ended in unjust tragedy. When we watch the news, we grieve all of this, but when we go to the movies, we want more of it. On the flight home from the funeral, I thought about my uncle's life and wondered what made his life so meaningful. He, he was like a good movie in a way, an indie movie perhaps, but a good film, a tearjerker at the end. I thought about the elements of our screenplay then, knowing the elements that make a story meaningful were the same that made a life meaningful. If Steve was right about a good story being a condensed version of life, that is, if story is just life without the meaningless scenes, I wondered if life could be lived more like a good story in the first place. I wondered whether a person could plan a story for his life and live it intentionally. I called Steve and asked him how he learned so much about story. I told Steve I wanted the information. Steve said, as a side note, that if I went to the seminar, I should be wary of asking questions, that McKee had little patience with trivial inquiries. He also told me to rent the movie Adaptation because there was a scene in the movie that takes place at one of McKee's seminars that will give you a feel for what you're getting into. In Adaptation, Nicolas Cage plays a screenwriter with writer's block, so he attends one of Robert McKee's seminars. McKee is played by the actor Brian Cox. He's pacing on stage, holding a cup of coffee, a giant movie screen behind him, and he's lecturing with intensity, saying screenwriters should never use voiceover narration, and they shouldn't think their movie could work without an essential structure. And somebody at the seminar asks a dumb question, and McGee's slows to a stop. He spoke to the woman in a voice that makes people turn white. He spoke to her until she began to cry practically. I made a mental note not to ask the real Robert McKee a stupid question, or for that matter, any questions at all. You'd never know there was so much to learn about story. There are antagonists and protagonists, story turns, and transitional dialogue. The whole thing is quite a science, really. Good stories don't happen by accident, I learned. They are planned. And after 36 hours of solid lectures in which neither Jordan or I asked a single question, we heard everything there was to hear about story, including what kinds of light bulbs worked best in the projector that would eventually show our film, and why the Koreans will never make a great sedan. Jordan looked back at the television and turned up the volume. A story is a character who wants something and overcomes conflict to get it, he said with remarkable assurance. What's that again? I asked, reaching for a pen and flipping the bulk of pages in my yellow pad over my lap, arriving at a blank page. A character, he said, who wants something, he continued, and overcomes conflict. He paused so I could write it down to get it. I looked at the definition for a second, wondering how simple it really was. He was right. A character who wants something and overcomes conflict to get it is the basic structure of a good story. That's it, I said to him. That's the essence of a story. The antagonist, Jordan shouted, pointing at Newman on the television. But I kept thinking about the stuff we learned in the Robert McKee seminar. I knew from Jason's story that the same elements that make a movie meaningful are the ones that make a life meaningful. I knew a character had to face his greatest fears. That's a story. That's a story, stuff of a good story. I also knew from the McKee seminar that most of our greatest fears are relational. It's all that stuff about forgiveness and risking rejection and learning to love. We think stories are about getting money and security, but the truth is it all comes down to relationships. I tried not to think about that stuff, but I couldn't get it out of my mind. I knew a story was calling me. I knew I was going to have to see if my father was alive. And once you know what it takes to live a better story, you don't have a choice. Not living a better story would be like deciding to die, deciding to walk around numb until you die, and it's not natural to want to die. If the point of life is the same as the point of a story, the point of life is character transformation. If I got any comfort, as I set out on my first story, it was that in nearly every story, the protagonist is transformed. He's a jerk at the beginning and nice at the end, or a coward at the beginning and brave at the end. If the character doesn't change, the story hasn't happened yet. And if story is derived from real life, if story is just a condensed version of life, then life itself may be designed to change us so that we evolve from one kind of person to another. I have a friend named Marcos who was an art student at Reed College in Portland. For his senior thesis, he studied human beings as they physically mature. He used his own body for part of the story, carefully weighing each limb, inspecting his hands under a microscope, and photographing himself with varying facial hair configurations. It was a strange thesis, even for an art student, and especially considering he devoted nearly a year of his life to the work. But what Marcos was trying to figure out was worth it. He was trying to understand whether our physical bodies said something about our philosophical reality. When he finished, I asked Marcos what he discovered, and he said, essentially, humans are alive for the purpose of journey, kind of three-act structure. They are born and spend several years discovering themselves and the world, then plod through a long middle in which they are compelled to search for mate and reproduce, and also create stability out of natural instability. And then they find themselves at the end, at an ending that seems to be designed for reflection. At the end, their bodies are slower. They're not as easily distracted. They do less work and they think and feel about a life lived rather than look forward to a life getting started. He didn't know what the point of the journey was, but he did believe we were designed to search for and find something. And he wondered out loud if the point wasn't the search, but the transformation the search creates. A character is what he does. Once I understood the power of story in my life, I wanted to know about how to create one, a good one. I was getting up a little bit earlier. And interestingly enough, I was going to fewer movies. In a way, I'd started a new story about trying to find a story. So I didn't need to escape my boring life anymore. I was a character who wanted something. Well, that's half the battle. And I kept learning more about story. I learned that not just any character can work to create a good story. It takes a specific kind of character. And not just any ambition would define a good story. It took a specific kind of ambition. The elements of story were conditional, in other words. These conditions were fixed principles too, and every good screenwriter knows them the way a musician knows his scales. Ben asked if I read a book called Save the Cat. I told him I hadn't. He said it was a screenwriter's book, a how-to for writing movies. I didn't know what that had to do with Don making a movie move on Penny, but Ben explained, Save the Cat comes from a trick storytellers use to engage an audience. In the first 20 minutes of the story, Ben said, your protagonist has to do something good. He can be crabby and have a drinking problem and even be a bit of a jerk, but unless he does something good, the audience won't want things to work out for him and they'll lose interest in your story. We have to see that Don has a good heart. Ben said he has to save a cat. A story is made up of turns, Robert McKee says. Once an ambition has been decided, a positive turn is an event that moves the protagonist closer to the ambition, and a negative turn moves the protagonist away from his ambition. All stories have both. If a story doesn't have negative turns, it's not an interesting story. A protagonist who understands this idea lives a better story. He doesn't give up when he encounters a setback because he knows that every story has both positive and negative turns. But what do you do when your ambition is no longer attainable? What do you do when your story ends just as it begins? In a way, I have to confess, I was relieved to hear my father had passed away. I didn't want to have to introduce myself having never accomplished anything remotely athletic. As near as I could tell from reading those books, marketing is a three-step process. The first step is to convince people they are miserable. The second step is to convince people they will be happy if they buy your product. And the third step is to include a half-naked woman in your pitch. I read so many of these ideas, I actually considered creating a magazine ad showing a teacher in a bikini draped seductively over a pile of geometry books. As I said before, the main way we learn stories is not through movies or books, it's through each other. You become like the people you interact with. And if your friends are living boring stories, you probably will too. We teach our children good or bad stories, what is worth living for and what is worth dying for, what is worth pursuing, and the dignity with which a character engages his own narrative. There's no way I could have anticipated the positive turn that would take place. We were 50 miles from the nearest road after all, but the next morning I met the greatest real life storyteller I will perhaps ever know, a person who has forever adjusted my moral compass and destroyed all the bridges leading back to a common life. That person was Bob, the guy I've told you about a few times, the guy who has written down more than 500 pages of memories. Maria and the kids came down with desserts, pastries they baked while we've been talking out on the deck. Bob gave me a walk around the property, showing me the hydroelectric plant he built on a stream and explaining what the land looked like before the lodge, which he had created in a place where once there had been nothing. I asked Bob what was the key to living such a great story, and Bob seemed uncomfortable with the idea he was anything special. But he wanted to answer my question, so he thought about it and said he didn't think we should be afraid to be whimsy. I asked him what he meant by whimsy, and he struggled to define it. He said it's that nagging idea that life could be magical. It could be special if we were only willing to take a few risks. The night we left Bob's dock, I didn't want to paddle through the night or across the wide inlet. We didn't leave his dock till after midnight, and we had to paddle for hours through the pitch black. And in the middle, the inlet was so large and the dark was so dark we couldn't make out either shore. We had to guide ourselves by stars, each boat gliding close to another, just the sound of our oars coming in and out of the water to keep us close. I think this is when most people give up on their stories. They come out of college, want to change the world, want to get married, want to have kids, and change the way people buy office supplies. But they get into the middle and discover it was harder than they thought. They can't see the distant shore anymore, and they wonder if their paddling is moving them forward. None of the trees behind them are getting smaller, and none of the trees ahead are getting bigger. They take it out on their spouses, and they go looking for an easier story. Robert McKee put down his coffee cup and leaned onto the podium. He put his head on his forehead and wiped back his gray hair. He said, "You have to go there. You have to take your character to the place where he just can't take it anymore." He looked at us with a tenderness we hadn't seen in him before. "You've been there, haven't you? You've been out on the ledge. The marriage is over now. The dream is over now. Nothing good can come from this." He got louder. "Writing a story isn't about making your peaceful fantasies come true. The whole point of the story is the character arc. You needn't think joy could change a person, did you? Joy is what you feel when the conflict is over, but it's conflict that changes a person." His voice was like thunder now. "You put your characters through hell. You put them through hell. That's the only way we change." I saw a story on 60 Minutes a few months ago about the happiest country in the world. It was Denmark. A study done by a British university ranked the happiest countries, and America was far down the list, but Denmark was on top. Morley Safer explored why, ruling out financial status, physical health, and even social freedom. He landed on a single characteristics of the Danes that allowed them such containment. The reason Danes are so happy was this: they had low expectations. I'm not making that up. There is something in Denmark's culture that allows them to look at life realistically. They don't expect products to fulfill them or relationships to end all their problems. In fact, in the final interview of the segment, Safer was sitting across from a Danish man and remarked to him that when Americans find out the happiest place on earth is Denmark, they're going to want to move there. Without missing a beat, the Danish man looked at Morley and said, "Well, honestly, they'll probably be let down." All of this may sound depressing to you, but I don't mean it to be. I've lived some good stories now, and those stories have improved the quality of my life. But I've also let go of the idea things will ever be made perfect, at least while I am walking around on this planet. I've let go of the idea that this life has a climax. I'm trying to be more Danish, I guess. And the thing is, it works. When you stop expecting people to be perfect, you can like them for who they are. And when you stop expecting material possessions to complete you, you'd be surprised at how much pleasure you get in material things. And when you stop expecting God to end all your troubles, you'd be surprised how much you like spending time with God.